Now that we've covered the function basics, we can take it up a notch in complexity. In this lesson, we're going to talk about functions with inputs, namely parameters and arguments. So I realize that if you're new to programming, you're going to be hearing a lot of new words in these lessons. And one thing I'll say is that when you're learning anything new, the hard thing isn't necessarily the concepts, it's often the language. And it doesn't really matter if it's programming or medicine or cooking. Every field has its own jargon and its own words. A big part of learning Python programming is learning some of this vocabulary. I'm going to be doing my best to introduce this vocabulary slowly over the course of the lessons. Now, I realize that learning vocabulary words doesn't sound very fun, but the upside is that you're not going to be learning words that people invented just to sound smart. Come to think of it, the Olympic champions of inventing meaningless words and catchphrases are probably the business consultants of this world. I've heard people say like the most ridiculous stuff with a completely straight face. I think my all-time favorites are words like helicoptering, which apparently means looking at things from above, and what's another one? Peeling the onion, which apparently means doing more analysis. So let's get back to Python programming, otherwise I won't be able to keep my lunch down. Looking at the code we've written previously, we can see that some functions take inputs. So for example, this use function here had an input called 538. And our read CSV function had an input that was a file name. All of these inputs to functions go in between the parentheses after the function name. In contrast, our getMilk function had no inputs. And this is the same with the show function, which also had no inputs. In contrast, the read CSV function had a piece of text between the parentheses, and this piece of text was the input to the function. These inputs are called arguments or parameters. Let's create our own function that takes an input. That way, we can put all of this into practice and see how the code actually works. I'm going to quickly copy-paste this code from the getMilk function into my cell below, and I'm going to modify this code. First, I'm going to give this function a different name. I'm going to call this function fill_the_fridge. Also, inside these parentheses, I'm going to specify an amount. This amount is going to be our input to our function. Finally, I'm going to modify our third print statement down here. So where it says by, I'm going to use the single quotes and the plus sign, and then I'm going to put amount here like so. So it reads by in single quotes plus amount plus single quotes cartons on the ground floor. This way, I'm making use of the input within the body of our function. The plus sign in this print statement concatenates our strings. And by concatenate, I mean merge or combine. Let's call this function to see it in action. So I'm going to hit Shift Enter, and then I'm going to write fill the fridge, which is the name of the function, followed by the parentheses, and then within the parentheses, I'm going to put single quotes and write 5 and hit Shift Enter. Now the piece of text that we entered between the parentheses shows up in our print statement. Let's think about what just happened here. First, you'll notice that the plus sign in Python actually means different things in different contexts. When the plus sign is used with numbers, it adds them together, but when the plus sign is used with text, it combines the strings. Let's call this function again, but this time let's substitute a different amount. I'm going to write fill the fridge, parentheses 1000, and hit Shift Enter. Let's look at this code and think very carefully about what's going on. Our fill the fridge function takes one input. That input has a name and is called amount. But the really cool part is how amount is just a placeholder. The value of amount is determined by whatever we specify when we call our fill the fridge function. The first time we specified the value 5, and amount held on to that piece of text. So the word 5 was printed in the print statement when we executed the function. But the second time we substituted the word 1000 so that the amount took on this value instead, and we saw 1000 printed out on the third line. In other words, amount behaves just like a variable. It gets its value when we call the function, and every time we refer to amount in the body of the function, we are able to use the value that's stored inside. Now there's two other things that you might notice about the code we just wrote. First, let's try to call this function with empty parentheses. So I'm going to write fill the fridge, separated by underscores, and then have empty parentheses and hit Shift Enter. In this case, we get an error. And the details of this error message read, missing one required argument, amount. In other words, because we've defined our function with an input, we must provide it. We specified one parameter in the function header, so we must give a value. We can't just leave it out. The other thing you'll notice at this point is that print is nothing other than a function as well. Print takes a piece of text as an input and prints it out below the cell. So if print is a function, that means we're calling a function inside our function. We're nesting our function calls. Functions inside functions is like, dreams within dreams in the movie Inception. In other words, one piece of code can trigger other bits of code. And this idea is actually really, really powerful when you think about it. Okay, so here's a quick recap. When working with functions with inputs, we specify what the input is up front when defining the function. The input is specified between the parentheses following the function name. In this example, the input is called money. And money is just a placeholder. In programming jargon, when referring to an input as a placeholder or as a variable, we tend to call it a parameter. As in, get milk has one parameter called money. Now, remember how I said we're going to have some vocabulary training? Well, when we call the function, we must provide a value to this parameter. In this case, we must provide a number. That value is going to be 20.5 when I call this function. The value that's passed to a function when it's being called is called an argument. Now, oftentimes, you'll see the words parameter and argument used interchangeably. People aren't always super pedantic in the real world. But if you want to express yourself precisely or get technical, it's good to know these definitions. A parameter is when we're referring to the inputs to a function and we're talking about it as the placeholder or as the variable. And we use the word argument when we're talking about the actual value that we're giving the function when we're calling it. But that's probably enough vocabulary training for now. And we've also covered quite a few different kinds of functions so far. For example, we understand the syntax behind show, and we also understand the syntax behind use or read CSV. Show had no arguments, but read CSV has a file name as an argument. Now we're going to look at functions with multiple arguments. We've actually encountered multiple arguments when we called the scatter function for our plot. And we also had multiple arguments when we called the fit function for our regression. Fit had two arguments, capital X and lowercase y. X was our movie budgets and lowercase y was our movie revenue. We can see that these two arguments are separated by a comma. But let's create our own function and have it take more than one argument so that we can see this in practice. Back in the Python intro notebook, I'm going to copy our previous function that we defined here, the fill the fridge function, and I'm going to paste it into the cell where we had the error. I'm now going to modify this function. First, by changing the name. So I'm going to call this function milk_mission. And then I'm also going to change the function header. I'm going to change the number of parameters that are between these two parentheses. So after amount, I'm going to add another parameter. I'm going to add a destination. We're going to use this parameter in our second print statement, which instead of reading walk to the store, we're going to have it read walk to the plus destination. So we're going to concatenate the string walk to the with whatever is supplied as a destination. I can't wait to try out our new function. So I'm going to hit Shift Enter, and then in the cell below, I'm going to call this function. I'm going to say milk_mission, and for amount, I'm going to write 20, and for destination, I'm going to write in single quotes department store. Here we can see that our first argument, 20, is going to be for the amount, and our second argument, department store, is going to be for destination. When I hit Shift Enter, I can see these values substituted into our print statement accordingly. Now here's the question. What do you think will happen if instead of writing milk mission 20, department store, we write milk mission department store, 20? You guessed it. I walk to the 20 and I buy department store cartons of milk. What this tells us is that our arguments to our function are passed by their position. In other words, the order in which we give the inputs to our function matters. And it matters quite a bit. The arguments are passed from left to right. So, as before, we must supply exactly 2 arguments when we're calling milk mission, but we also must be careful to supply these arguments in the right order. Now, looking at the syntax for calling a function, it still strikes me kind of strange every time I think about it. Imagine how this would play out in real life. Like, imagine your girlfriend or boyfriend telling you to go to the supermarket and saying, go buy eggs, potatoes, milk cartons, donuts, and apples. Buy 2, 10, 1, 12, and 5. This is confusing, right? And yet, many programming languages work exactly like this. But confusion is bad, and nobody wants to come back from the supermarket and have an argument with their partner because they've messed up the order of their arguments. Lucky for us, Python can actually help us have a successful relationship. It provides an alternative for passing arguments by position. We can also match our arguments by providing a name. Now, believe it or not, we actually did this previously in our notebook. Check out how we called scatter, for instance. We had x, y, color equals blue, alpha equals 0.3. The part that I want to draw your attention to is the part where it says color equals blue and alpha equals 0.3. Here we are matching our arguments by name. Let's go back to our milk mission function. Remember how when we got the order wrong, we printed nonsense? Well, we can add the name of our parameters to the function call so that Python will match these values by keyword. So if we say destination is equal to department store and amount is equal to 20 and press Shift Enter, we can see that the output below the cell updates to the way that we want it to, namely walk to the department store, buy 20 cartons on the ground floor. So here we are setting the destination equal to department store, and we're setting amount equal to 20. Looking at the code where we called scatter again, we can actually see that in this case, we're kind of mixing and matching, supplying arguments by position and by name. The equivalent when we're calling milk mission would look something like this. we'd have milk underscore mission, parentheses, 20, comma, destination equals store, and hit Shift Enter. In this case, the argument 20 is set by position and the destination is set by name. Now, personally, I actually quite like named arguments. They make the Python code much more readable. It's like having labels for the data. Suppose I went back where we called scatter and I deleted the names for these arguments. In this case, we just have x, y, blue 0.3. Anybody looking at this code is going to wonder, what on earth is 0.3? And that somebody might as well be yourself in like 2 weeks' time when you forgot what you did. I guess the message I'm trying to convey here is that having a bunch of naked values separated by commas doesn't make the code very readable to us humans. Providing these keywords when calling a function just makes everything so much more readable. So here's a question for you. What do you think will happen if we call our function like this? Milk underscore mission, parentheses, store, comma, amount equals 20. Hitting Shift Enter, we see that we get an error. And the reason is that we're trying to assign a value to amount twice. The first time we're assigning the store value to amount, because Python is evaluating our arguments by their position. And the second time, we're setting amount equal to 20 by using the keyword. Okay, cool. So we're coming to the end of this lesson on parameters and arguments. And we've covered a lot of material here. This material will sink in more with practice, I promise. And if you've heard any recent buzzwords that make you want to stick needles in your eyes, please share them in this lesson's Q&A section. I'd love to hear them. See you in the next lesson.